Someone get actual medical staff over here, not the help. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 90 seconds before his career began its slow collapse. He didn't know what he was looking at. He had no idea who stood 3 feet away, adjusting a wheelchair with hands that had held lives together in places he'd never survive. The truth was walking through St. Michael's Emergency Bay in Houston at 7:48 a.m. on a Tuesday, wearing scrubs and a name tag that read Bennett in small blue letters. The bay smelled like antiseptic and floor wax, sharp enough to taste. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead with the steady drone of a medical building at full operation. Laura Bennett's fingers worked the wheelchair adjustment with the precision of someone who'd done this 10,000 times, but there was something else in her movements, something military straight about her posture, something deliberate about the way she locked each wheel. Her scrubs were navy blue, regulation, unremarkable. But her right forearm bore a scar that ran 3 inches long, thin and white, the kind of mark that doesn't come from a kitchen accident or a childhood fall. The kind of mark that tells a story nobody asks to hear. The elderly Army Ranger sitting in the wheelchair looked confused. His name was Thomas Mercer, 72 years old, weathered like mahogany, with eyes that had seen things that never quite left. He wore a faded green jacket over his hospital gown, someone's idea of dignity. His left arm rested in his lap, trembling slightly. He'd already been turned away from 3 departments that morning. Cardiology said it wasn't cardiac. Orthopedic said it wasn't his joints. Neurology said it wasn't neurological. By the time he'd rolled into the emergency bay, he was muttering under his breath, repeating the same question over and over, "What's wrong with me? What's wrong with me?" Laura's fingers brushed against something in her scrub pocket as she adjusted the chair's footrest. A tarnished military challenge coin, worn smooth from 20 years of handling. It was the only personal item she carried. Not a photo, not a phone with pictures of a family that didn't exist, not a wedding ring or a letter from a life she'd left behind. Just the coin. Dull brass the color of old pennies, with an insignia stamped on one side, the kind of thing given to soldiers who'd done things worth remembering but never speaking about. Vitals look stable, Laura said, her voice quiet, careful. She wrapped a blood pressure cuff around Mercer's right arm. The cuff inflated with a soft hiss. BP's 118/76. Heart rate's running about 84. Mercer nodded, but his eyes were still distant. His jacket sleeve rode up slightly as he adjusted his position, and Laura saw it. Forearm tattoo, black ink, military-grade lettering. L. Bennett in capital letters. 2 words. Her initials. His name wasn't Bennett. But there it was, tattooed into his skin 15 years ago in a place called Baghdad. Laura didn't react. Her jaw didn't clench. Her pupils didn't dilate. A civilian would have shown something, recognition, shock, confusion. But Laura Bennett had spent 18 years learning to show nothing. She made a note on the chart. Heart rate elevated. BP normal for age. Patient reports confusion. No immediate red flags visible. She would let the tests tell the story. The tests didn't know anything about challenge coins or tattoos or the kind of secrets that get classified so deeply that they cease to exist. That was when Dr. Caldwell arrived. He came through the bay doors with the kind of entrance that people with inherited confidence always make, not hurried, but purposeful, as if his presence was something the room had been waiting for. He was 56 years old, dressed in a white coat that cost more than most people's monthly rent, with a Rolex that caught the fluorescent light just enough to make sure everyone noticed. His power wasn't something he'd earned through patient outcomes or research or any actual skill. His power came from board connections, from family money that had been old money for 3 generations, from a network of people who looked like him and thought like him and protected people like him. "Who's handling this patient?" Caldwell asked. He didn't look at Laura directly. He looked at the chart, then at the wheelchair, then at a space in the air about 2 feet above Laura's head. "I am," Laura said. Her voice didn't waver. Presenting with altered mental status. Negative workup so far from 3 departments. "Someone get actual medical staff over here, and not the help," Caldwell said. He still wasn't looking at her. He was already pulling out his phone, already moving past her like she was furniture. I want a full cardiopulmonary workup. EKG, troponin, chest X-ray, full metabolic panel. This patient needs real physicians, not, he gestured vaguely in her direction with his free hand, a dismissal that looked like he was swatting at air, support staff adjusting wheelchairs. Laura didn't flinch. She didn't burn red. She didn't retreat to a supply closet somewhere to cry. She simply continued her work. She finished taking Mercer's blood pressure. She recorded the numbers. She checked his pupils, reactive to light, equal and round. She felt his pulse at his wrist, steady, strong for a man his age. Her hands moved on their own, the result of muscle memory so deep that no insult could interrupt it. What they didn't know was that Laura had performed emergency thoracotomies in field hospitals under fire. She had resuscitated patients whose hearts had stopped beating for 47 minutes. She had diagnosed a perforated bowel by palpation alone when imaging was unavailable. She had trained the surgeons. But that version of her didn't exist anymore. That version of her had been erased from official records by order of the Pentagon in 2009, buried under classified operations and redacted files, and a new identity constructed from thin air. Here at St. Michael's, she was just a nurse. Caldwell was already on his phone as he walked. I need cardiology back here stat. The ER is letting support staff take patient histories now. It's an embarrassment. His voice carried across the bay. 3 other nurses heard it. 2 residents heard it. A med student heard it. The message was clear: Laura Bennett didn't belong here. By 8:15 a.m., Caldwell had made his way to the staff lounge on the 3rd floor. 14 people were in there: nurses, residents, 1 attending from infectious disease, 2 radiology techs, and the unit secretary who knew everything that happened in the hospital before it happened. Caldwell poured himself a coffee from the pot that had been sitting there since 6 a.m., and he smiled the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "That new nurse," he said, loud enough for the room to hear, "Bennett. The one who can't even ask the right questions during triage. $5 says she's gone within a week. Hospitals like this don't need people who can't recognize their own limitations." He held up his Rolex. "Any takers?" 3 people laughed. 1 person said, "I'll take that bet." Caldwell felt the familiar rush of certainty that came from being a man who'd never been told no in his life. He felt the institutional weight of St. Michael's behind him, the board meetings where his father-in-law held a seat, the donor plaques with family names on 3 different wings, the network of physicians and administrators who'd gone to the same schools and belonged to the same clubs. He was protected by systems that had been designed to protect people exactly like him. What he didn't understand was that Laura Bennett operated on a different system entirely. A system built on survival. A system where the quiet ones were the most dangerous because they'd already survived the worst the world had to offer. Thomas Mercer sat in the wheelchair in the emergency bay, staring at his own forearm without understanding why he'd had someone's initials tattooed there so many years ago. His wallet was in a small bag attached to the chair. Inside that wallet, kept in a zippered compartment for 15 years, was a twin to the coin in Laura's pocket. Same insignia. Same weight. Same history. He carried it without knowing why, the way soldiers carry things after war's end, without understanding that they might be carrying pieces of their own salvation. The machines around him beeped their mechanical rhythm. The monitor showed his heart tracing its steady line across the screen. One by one, his tests came back negative, then negative again, then inconclusive, then normal. By noon, he still had no diagnosis, no explanation, no relief from the confusion that had driven him to the hospital. But he was in the right place. His salvation was already inside St. Michael's. She was just 3 floors away, making notes, checking other patients, waiting for the moment when everything would change. The moment when muscle memory and training and 18 years of silence would finally come due. The staff lounge fell quiet after Caldwell left. The betting pool stayed open. Nobody knew yet that they were standing on the edge of something. Nobody understood that the hierarchy they saw, with Caldwell at the apex and Laura Bennett at the bottom, was about to collapse like a building whose foundation had been built on sand. The challenge coins remained in their separate pockets. The tattoo remained on Mercer's forearm. The truth remained buried under layers of redacted files and classified operations and official silence. All of it waiting. All of it patient. All of it about to be revealed by circumstances that nobody could have predicted and nobody could have stopped. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless song. The machines beeped. The hospital continued its work, unaware that the most important salvation happening in those walls wasn't being delivered by the men in expensive coats or the systems they'd built to protect themselves. It was being delivered by a woman in scrubs who'd learned long ago that the quietest person in the room was often the one holding everything together. The hospital cafeteria smelled like overheated grease and industrial disinfectant, the kind of smell that sank into your scrubs and never quite left. Laura carried her tray past the tables where physicians sat in clusters, their white coats draped over chair backs like territorial flags. Caldwell's table was near the window. She saw him before she passed, saw the deliberate angle of his elbow, saw the calculation in his eyes. She didn't break stride. She didn't slow down. His arm extended as she passed. Not an accident. The timing was too precise, the movement too controlled. The tray left her hands and rotated through the air, a half-second of defiance before physics took over. It struck the tile with a sound like gunfire in an enclosed space. Food scattered. A container of soup splattered across the floor in a corona of red. Other staff members froze, forks suspended, conversations dying mid-sentence. "Oops," Caldwell said without looking up from his phone. His colleagues laughed, the quick, nervous laughter of people who knew what they'd just witnessed but preferred not to acknowledge it. Laura knelt. Her hands moved with the kind of steadiness that came from muscle memory older than civilian life. Pieces of sandwich, lettuce, a plastic fork. The soup continued to spread across the tile, and she followed it, gathering each fragment methodically. Her jaw had clenched once when the tray hit the floor, barely perceptible, a micro-expression that lasted half a second. After that, her face became stone. She didn't look at Caldwell. Didn't acknowledge the laughter. Just knelt in the middle of the cafeteria while 40 physicians watched a nurse clean up after a man who'd orchestrated her humiliation like a conductor running through a rehearsed symphony. A resident whispered to the woman beside him, "Why doesn't she just quit?" The other shrugged. Laura scraped the last of the soup into a napkin and stood, holding the collected mess in both hands. Her scrubs were spotless except for a single drop of soup on her right sleeve. She walked to the trash bin, disposed of everything, and left the cafeteria without ordering another lunch. 20 minutes later, she stood at the ranger's bedside reviewing his chart. The wheelchair sat beside the bed. He'd been trying to stand when his pain spiked, and now he was back in the seat, his weathered hands gripping the armrests. His forearm was visible, the Army Ranger tattoo faded to a pale blue from 15 years of sun and scar tissue. Below it, in smaller letters, Bennett. She'd seen it when she admitted him. She hadn't connected it to herself. Caldwell appeared in the doorway. She felt his presence before she saw him, the way you sense a predator across a room, a pressure change in the air, a shift in how oxygen moved. He had a patient chart in his hands, and his smile had teeth in it. "Bennett," he said, loud enough for the nurse's station to hear. "Need to talk about your documentation." She turned. His eyes were bright with something that looked like hunger. He threw the chart. Not dropped. Through. The folder spun through the air and pages scattered across the floor like leaves, each one tumbling independently, settling in a pattern that guaranteed maximum mess. The ranger watched this exchange. His hand moved unconsciously to his forearm, touching the tattoo as if reassuring himself it was still there. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Caldwell said. His voice carried down the hallway, and she heard footsteps pause at the nurse's station. People were listening now. That was the point. "I need it filed properly." "You do know how to file, don't you?" His colleagues had begun to gather. A resident. An attending physician. The charge nurse. Laura bent. She picked up each page, not quickly, not with frustration, but with the careful attention of someone disarming ordnance. Each page was placed in sequence. Each one handled with the same steady hands that had held lives together in places Caldwell would never see. Her breathing remained controlled, in through the nose, out through the mouth. A technique learned in sandstorms and gunfire. A technique that meant she could keep functioning when her body wanted to fracture. That's it, Caldwell continued, his voice bright with satisfaction. Nice and slow. Make sure you get it right this time. She returned the reassembled chart to his hands. Her eyes met his for exactly 1 second. No anger there. No tears. No trembling. Just a flat, measuring gaze that seemed to look through him rather than at him. Is there anything else, Doctor? Her voice didn't waver. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Uncertainty. The possibility that she might be something other than what he'd assumed. Then it was gone, replaced by the familiar arrogance. No. That's all. She returned to the ranger's care. His medications. His vitals. The routine patterns that structured a day into something manageable. He watched her work, his weathered hands still, his eyes tracking her movements with an intensity that suggested he was trying to play something he couldn't quite remember. You okay, miss? His voice was quiet, the kind of voice that came from someone who'd learned to whisper in places where volume meant death. She checked his oxygen saturation without looking up. I'm fine, sir. You don't look fine. She didn't respond. She had learned long ago that the best defense against observation was to become unremarkable. To fold herself into the background. To become the kind of person people saw every day and forgot before they reached the parking lot. Caldwell's voice carried back through the ward. He was at the nurse's station now, speaking to the charge nurse, his tone casual but pitched to be overheard. I'm not sure where we're sourcing our staff these days, but I have to say I'm concerned. Bennett seems to have some confidence issues. Good intentions, obviously, but there's a difference between enthusiasm and actual capability. The charge nurse, Martha, who'd worked with Laura for 3 months without incident, made a non-committal sound. I just hope administration is thinking long-term about their hiring practices, Caldwell continued. Wouldn't want someone's overconfidence creating liability issues. Just the kind of thing that gets flagged in reviews. Laura finished checking the ranger's medications. The full line was running clean. His heart rate was holding steady at 72. She made notes in the electronic system, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the same methodical precision she'd used collecting soup from a cafeteria floor. The ranger cleared his throat. That doctor. You work with him long. A few weeks. He seems like the type who needs an audience. She didn't answer. She was thinking about the supply closet 3 doors down, the one that nobody used because maintenance had labeled it condemned. She was thinking about what her hands might do if she allowed them to do anything other than their current work. She excused herself and walked down the hallway to the supply closet. She opened the door, stepped inside, and closed it behind her. The air was thick with the smell of cardboard and old bleach. She gripped the edge of a metal shelf until her knuckles went white, her breathing suddenly audible in the darkness. This was the part that nobody understood. The part that didn't show. Not the humiliation, that was survivable, had been survived in far worse circumstances. It was the restraint. The act of holding everything in place. The discipline required to stand in front of a man who was trying to break you and refused to break. She released the shelf and stepped back into the hallway. The ranger was still in his room, still watching the door. When she returned, he didn't ask where she'd been. He just said, I think you're doing fine, miss. For what it's worth. She nodded. She continued her work. And then, 20 minutes later, as she stood at the nurse's station, the ranger's monitor began to alarm. His rhythm had changed. The steady beat became irregular, then became something worse. His chest pain had returned, and this time it wasn't subsiding. She moved before anyone else, reaching his room in 4 seconds. He was slumped forward in the wheelchair, his hand pressed against his sternum, his breath coming in shallow gasps. She checked his pulse. Nothing. No carotid pulse. No femoral pulse. The monitor confirmed what her fingers already knew: the heart had stopped. "Crash cart," she called out. Her voice had changed octaves. It was no longer the voice of someone asking. It was the voice of someone commanding. Now. The code team was 4 minutes away. The patient had 90 seconds, maybe less. Dr. Caldwell appeared from a patient room, took in the situation at a glance, and made his decision based on what he'd been trained to do in a classroom decades ago. "Standard CPR protocol," he said. "We'll wait for the code team." But standard CPR wouldn't work here. Not with this patient's cardiac history. Not with the degree of compromise. Laura's eyes flicked to his chart. She had options and approximately 75 seconds to decide which one she'd survive using. "Scalpel," she said. 14-gauge needle. "I need the crash cart." "That's not protocol," someone said, the attending tech, confusion in his voice. Laura's eyes met his. When she spoke, each word was a separate command, delivered with the kind of authority that came from years of making decisions when people's lives depended on her being right. "Scalpel. Now." He got it. Dr. Caldwell was pulling his phone from his pocket, beginning to dial. He was already composing the narrative he'd tell the board chairman: an incident, a nurse acting outside her scope of practice, a situation that would require documentation and investigation. He was protecting himself while she was saving a life, and he was doing it with the kind of institutional efficiency that had worked perfectly until right now. Laura's hands had steadied. This was different. This was what she'd been trained for, what no civilian nursing school could teach, what came back the moment the switch was flipped from caution to action. She opened the chest with a single, precise incision through the 5th intercostal space, the scalpel moving with a kind of certainty that comes from having done this before, in conditions far worse than a hospital hallway. She found the pericardium, opened it, and her hands that had cleaned soup from a cafeteria floor less than an hour earlier, moved directly to the heart itself. Direct cardiac massage. Her fingers found the organ, began the rhythmic compression, pump pump pump, each movement a negotiation with death itself. The ranger's body responded. The monitor showed the first tentative beats, then strengthened, then became a rhythm that looked almost normal. The hallway had gone silent except for the monitor's steady beeping. Staff members had frozen in place. Dr. Caldwell's phone had lowered to his side, forgotten. The ranger gasped. His body convulsed once and then stabilized. His eyes opened. The code team arrived 40 seconds later to find a patient who was already resuscitated, already stabilizing, already breathing on his own. They exchanged glances. They looked at Laura, still positioned at his side, her scrub soaked with blood, her hand steady as a surgical laser. She extracted her hands, called for sutures, and stepped back. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm. "Vitals are stable. Heart rate 92, blood pressure coming up. He's oxygenating on his own." One of the code team doctors looked at her, then at Caldwell, then back at Laura. "What happened here?" "Emergency thoracotomy," Laura said. "Direct cardiac massage." He was in asystole for approximately 90 seconds. No response to standard protocol. Caldwell was already moving away, his phone back to his ear, already spinning the narrative, already making calls to protect what he'd just watched become indefensible. And Laura stood there in the hallway of St. Michael's Hospital in Houston, covered in blood, with a tarnished military challenge coin still sitting in her scrub pocket, a coin pressed into a ranger's palm 15 years ago in Baghdad, a coin he'd kept in his wallet ever since, a coin that was about to become the most important piece of evidence in what was about to unfold. But he didn't know that yet. None of them did. The ranger's hand trembled against the wheelchair armrest as he rolled past radiology, his breathing shallow and fast. Chest pain. Real chest pain, not the phantom sensation that woke him most nights, the memory of shrapnel that had never actually lodged in his ribs but lived there anyway, 15 years after Baghdad. He opened his mouth to call for help. Nothing came out except a sound like gravel in a throat. His left arm went numb. Laura Bennett was exactly 10 feet away, walking back from the supply closet with fresh saline bags, when the ranger's body went rigid. She watched his head snap backward. Watched his right hand claw at his shirt. Watched the wheelchair begin to tip sideways as his body seized with the electricity of a failing heart. The saline bags hit the tile floor with a wet splash. She didn't think. Thinking was for people who had the luxury of time. Her boots moved on their own, 3 strides, and she was on her knees beside him, already reaching for the crash cart that sat 20 feet down the corridor. A younger nurse, Marcus, froze near the water fountain. "Call code blue," Laura said, not louder, just clear. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Marcus ran. Her hands were already moving. Scissors from her pocket, trauma shears with an engraved call sign on the blade that she'd carried for 17 years, and she cut straight through his hospital gown and undershirt, opening him to the sterile lights of the hallway. His skin was grey, cooling. The heart monitor on the crash cart was still 10 seconds away. She didn't wait for it. The scalpel came from the emergency kit on the cart the moment Marcus wheeled it over, and Laura's muscle memory took control like muscle memory always does. Her fingers knew the anatomical landmarks better than her conscious mind knew its own name. 4th intercostal space. Midclavicular line. She pressed the scalpel into the space between his ribs and cut in one fluid motion, 12 centimeters deep. The ribs felt familiar under her hands, the same ribs she'd learned to open in a field hospital in Fallujah, in a compound in Sanjin Valley where the ventilators ran on generators and the morphine supply lasted exactly 8 days if you rationed it. Blood welled up. Dark and desperate. She opened the chest cavity wider, her left hand steady on the rib spreader while her right hand positioned itself inside his thoracic cage. The heart was there, slack and silent, a muscle that had given up. Direct cardiac massage. Not chest compressions from the outside. The real thing. Her hand closed around the heart itself, palm against the left ventricle, and she began to squeeze, rhythmic, firm, the squeeze of someone who understood that this organ was tissue and electricity and the last thing standing between this man and death. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. Release. Not compressions. Not the theatrical pushing on a sternum that worked for maybe 1 in 20 arrests. This was precision. This was knowing that the heart in your palm needed to be reminded that it had a job. "Charge the paddles," she said. Her voice had changed. No longer the deferential nurse who'd accepted being called the help in front of patients. This was the voice of someone who'd given orders that moved weapons-grade operators, who'd stood in dust and smoke and directed people on whether they lived or died. The attending, Dr. Morrison, arrived with the crash team, a cardiology fellow, 2 nurses, a respiratory therapist wheeling the ventilator. They stopped. They saw a woman with her hand inside a patient's chest in a public hallway, blood on her forearms, her voice dropping out instructions like she'd been born speaking them. "O2 sat," she asked. 41, the respiratory therapist said, already bagging, already pushing oxygen into lungs that weren't using it. "Push 1 of epi," Laura said. The fellow moved to inject epinephrine into the 4 line that Marcus had somehow gotten in during the chaos. Laura continued the massage, each squeeze a beat of pressure, her own heartbeat synchronized to his, her muscle memory channeling 17 years of training that had never officially happened and never would be documented anywhere except in scars and in the hands of a man in Baghdad who still remembered her call sign. 60 seconds. 80 seconds. 110 seconds of direct cardiac massage while the hallway filled with the sound of machinery and the beeping of monitors and someone in the distance calling for the ICU to prepare a bed for emergency admission. "Shock advised," the defibrillator announced in its synthetic voice. "Charging." Laura's hand came out. The paddles met his chest. 200 joules. The body convulsed. The monitors screamed. She waited. 1 second. 2 seconds. Then her hand was back inside his chest and she was massaging again, feeling for the flutter, the hint of a beat, the electrical storm that meant his heart was remembering how to work. The blood was warm on her hands. Familiar. Pain was information. Blood was data. Both of them were telling her that this man was still salvageable. 50 meters down the hallway, Dr. Caldwell stepped out of the cardiology office where he'd been reviewing his morning's triumph, the note in the staff lounge about how Laura Bennett would crack, would quit, would prove herself incompetent. He heard the chaos. The crash cart. The code blue announcement. He saw the crowd forming around something in the corridor outside radiology. For a moment, he felt the structure beneath him shift. 140 seconds into the arrest, the monitor showed it first, a flutter. Then a beat. Then a rhythm that wasn't sinus yet but was something, was electrical activity, was the heart remembering that it had contracts to keep. Laura felt it under her palm before the machines announced it. The muscle began to squeeze on its own. Weak. Tentative. But present. Sinus rhythm, she said. We have sinus rhythm. The ICU team was already there, already moving, already prepared to transport. Dr. Morrison looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in the corridor's fluorescent nightmare, something shifted in his expression. Not gratitude exactly. Recognition. The way you look at someone when you realize that the person you thought was a nurse is actually something else entirely, something you don't have a name for yet. ICU now, Laura said. She was still kneeling, still covered in blood, still holding the edges of the open chest as they prepared the patient for transport. Bring him straight to the cardiac unit. Someone get me 2-0 silk sutures. We're closing this before transport. The fellow hesitated. Looked at Dr. Morrison. Looked back at Laura. She said now, Morrison said quietly. The sutures came. Laura's hands moved with the absolute certainty of someone who'd sewn chest cavities shut in dust and darkness, who'd taught herself to do it with one hand while holding pressure with the other because there was no one else and failure meant burying someone's son. Her fingers worked through the intercostal muscles, the fascia, the skin, closing the incision with the precision of a flag ceremony, each stitch exact and tight and perfect. 8 minutes from cardiac arrest to stable transport. The ranger was conscious by the time they wheeled him toward the ICU, his eyes focusing, his hand reaching out toward the woman in the blood-soaked scrubs. She was walking beside him, maintaining visual contact, checking his pupils with the confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. You, he whispered. His voice was rust and gravel. I know you. Laura didn't answer. Didn't smile. Her composure held like granite. She just nodded once and stepped back as the ICU team took him into the elevator, her hand still shaking, no, not shaking, trembling with the kind of adrenaline that came from holding a human heart and forcing it to remember how to beat. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the thing that would end her career by sundown. Dr. Caldwell didn't wait for the code team to clear the hallway. While the ranger's chest still heaved with the mechanical rise and fall of the ventilator, while his heart monitor traced the fragile green line that Laura had written back into existence, Caldwell was already moving toward the administrator's office with the purposeful stride of a man who'd just been handed a gift. His phone was in his hand before he reached the door. The board chairman answered on the first ring. Caldwell had his private number memorized, had called it 17 times in the past 3 years for exactly this kind of moment. Richard. It's Caldwell at St. Michael's. His voice carried the tone of a man delivering critical intel. We have a credential fraud situation. Potentially catastrophic liability exposure. The nurse I mentioned in my previous correspondence, the one I've flagged for protocol violations, just performed an unsanctioned emergency thoracotomy. Saved the patient, yes, but the technique suggests either fabricated credentials or military background she's failed to disclose. I've already initiated an investigation. The pause on the line was exactly what he wanted. Shock. Silence. The sound of institutional machinery beginning to grind. I'm going to need external auditors in here by noon. Someone independent. Someone who understands what we're protecting. He hung up before Richard could ask questions. Caldwell understood institutional power the way a musician understood silence. It was the space between notes that created meaning. He'd spent 23 years building a network of obligations and alliances, and this moment was precisely why. The board chairman owed him 3 favors. The hospital's insurance carrier owed him consulting fees on malpractice cases. The state licensing board had his brother-in-law on the ethics committee. Laura Bennett, whoever she actually was, had just handed him the justification he'd been searching for. By 11:30, Caldwell was on the phone with the director of nursing at Houston Medical Center, where Laura's credentials indicated she'd worked for years prior. His voice dripped with concern, the careful inflection of a peer reaching out to protect the profession. "I'm doing routine vetting on a nurse who transferred from your facility in 2019, he said, his tone suggesting he was doing them a favor by catching something they'd missed. Laura Bennett. Exceptional clinical skills, almost unnaturally fast in emergency situations. I'm wondering if there's anything in her background, anything that might explain why her medical decision-making seems to bypass standard protocols. Any behavioral red flags? Any questions about where her training actually came from?" He let that question hang. Let it imply. The director said she'd call him back. She did, within 10 minutes, and her voice had shifted, uncertainty replacing confidence. "Her references check out, but you're right that her early employment records are sparse. We assumed she was travel nursing before that, but the actual documentation. She didn't finish. She didn't have to." 2 hours after that call, Caldwell contacted the state licensing board directly, citing procedural concerns about credential verification during a federal nursing shortage. By 3 o'clock, an external investigator named Morrison had arrived at St. Michael's carrying a leather portfolio and the kind of expression that suggested she'd seen this movie before, suspected credential fraud, probably nothing, routine audit, everyone goes home. Caldwell walked her to the records room himself, his hand on her elbow in that gesture of institutional camaraderie that suggested they were on the same team, protecting the same thing. "Her file is remarkably thin for a nurse with her clinical competency," Caldwell said as Morrison opened Laura's personnel folder. "That's actually what concerned me most. You'd expect more evidence of progression, more continuing education, more," he trailed off, letting Morrison come to the conclusion herself. The investigator's pen paused. "Her initial hire documentation is dated July 2021. That's barely 2 years of employment history. Where did she work before St. Michael's?" "That's the question," Caldwell said. "She listed Houston Medical Center from 2018 to 2019, but their director seemed uncertain about the dates when I called. 4-year gap before that. No documentation. No references." "No," he smiled, the kind of smile that said he hated to be right about this. "It's unusual, isn't it?" Morrison was already making notes. She pulled up Laura's application, her references, the sparse documentation that the military had left behind when they buried her. 2 years. That's all they'd given her. 2 years of nursing credentials, 2 years of employment history, everything before that redacted or erased or never created at all. The military didn't leave loose threads for people who'd been in DevGru. They didn't leave anything. They created a ghost identity that could withstand casual scrutiny but would collapse the moment someone actually looked. Morrison looked. By 4:30, she'd drafted a preliminary report recommending immediate suspension pending comprehensive credential verification. By 5 o'clock, the hospital administrator had signed the suspension papers. By 5:45, Laura was standing in the employee relations office listening to words like pending investigation and credential verification and maintain your hospital privileges on restricted status, her face perfectly composed while her career imploded in real time. They gave her until end of shift to collect her personal items and return her access badge. The investigator would need to speak with her formally, but not today. Not until the federal background check cleared. Not until they understood who she actually was. Laura walked to the hospital laundry room because that's where she kept her things, the small locker assigned to housekeeping staff that had remained undisturbed through 14 years of hiding. The air hung thick with the smell of industrial detergent and the heat from the industrial dryers, that particular combination of bleach and humidity that clung to everything in places designed for transformation. Clean things emerged from dirty ones. That was the entire purpose of this room. Order restored. Contamination removed. She opened her locker. 3 sets of extra scrubs, a cardigan she'd worn once, a photograph she should never have kept, the ranger in his dress uniform in 2008, before Baghdad, his arm around a woman who was now ex-wife, his smile still intact. She'd kept it because operational security felt less important than the reminder that the people she saved got to have lives after. They got to have second chances. They got to move on. The scrubs she was wearing came off first. She changed into civilian clothes, grey pants, a dark blue shirt, the uniform of invisibility. Then she picked up the scrubs she'd been wearing when she saved the ranger's life, still carrying the faint smell of blood and antiseptic and the particular staleness that comes from running trauma codes in summer heat. She walked to the folding station and she began to fold them. Fold the sleeves inward. Align the edges. Smooth the fabric from center outward. The precision wasn't habit, it was something else. A ritual. A flag ceremony. Each fold placed the scrubs one step closer to erasure, to the point where they would be washed and redistributed and no one would know they'd ever been worn by someone who mattered. That was the military way. Equipment got used, equipment got cleaned, equipment became generic again. Humans were just a category of equipment that took longer to process. She folded the bottom hem up. Then the sides inward. Then she folded them again, creating smaller and smaller versions of the same shape. This is what the military had taught her, how to reduce things. How to compress complicated people into simple categories. Master Chief became nurse. Divgru became housekeeping. The woman who carried a man 6 miles through gunfire became the woman who folded scrubs in a laundry room at 5:47 in the evening, suspended for credential fraud she couldn't defend without breaking 23 years of operational security. The scrubs formed a perfect rectangle. She held it for 10 seconds. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. Her face was stone. But in that moment, alone in a room that smelled like industrial dissolution, her hand trembled once, not from fear but from something else. The kind of trembling that comes from perfect control held against impossible pressure. The kind of shaking that happens when someone has learned to hide everything except for one involuntary moment of something breaking just slightly. She placed the folded scrubs in the return bin. Closed the locker. Picked up her cardigan. Turned and walked toward the door. The door pushed open onto a hallway where Dr. Caldwell had not yet realized he'd just activated something that couldn't be shut down again. Couldn't be negotiated with. Couldn't be destroyed by board connections and insurance carriers and the careful architecture of institutional power. He'd activated the person behind the nurse. But that wasn't what would matter in the next 24 hours. What would matter was that he'd forced her to surface. What would matter was the phone call that came at 6:14 the next morning, the one that made every administrator at St. Michael's understand that they'd just suspended a ghost, and ghosts had paperwork that reached higher than any board chairman's private number. What would matter was the sound of helicopter rotors 40 minutes later, the kind of sound that made Dr. Caldwell understand that he'd just picked a fight with someone who could summon the federal government just by answering a phone call from someone who'd been waiting 14 years to use her real name again. The next morning arrived like a verdict. The screaming started in Trauma Bay 3 at 7:14 a.m., a man in 4-point restraints thrashing against the leather cuffs, Arabic pouring from his mouth in a torrent of rage and terror that made 3 orderlies step back. His eyes were wild, unfocused, pupils blown wide as dimes. The psychiatric team moved in with syringes loaded and ready, sedative doses enough to drop a horse, and within 4 minutes his thrashing slowed to twitching, then to the shallow breathing of forced sleep. The room exhaled. The staff dispersed. Nobody knew what they'd just witnessed, not yet. Sedation wore off in layers. First, the eye movement. Then the fingers, curling and uncurling against the restraints. Then consciousness leaked back in like water through cracked glass, slow and inevitable. The man's breathing deepened. His jaw tensed. And then his eyes opened, and they scanned the room with military precision, left to right, ceiling to door, cataloguing threats and exits the way only trained soldiers do. When his gaze locked on Laura Bennett standing at the monitor station, checking the fall line and writing notes on the chart, something shifted in his expression. Recognition. Not of her face, 15 years was a chasm, but of something deeper. Something muscle memory knew before the mind caught up. His lips moved. The word came out like a prayer, phantom. The room didn't immediately understand. Nurses continued charting. A respiratory tech adjusted the ventilator settings. But then the veteran security guard, call sign Bear, retired Navy SEAL, 23 years active duty, went rigid. His head snapped toward Laura like a compass finding north. He'd heard that word exactly twice in his life, both times in the dark, both times before everything went sideways. JSOC call signs weren't spoken in public. JSOC call signs were classified, compartmentalized, known only to the operators in the task force and the Joint Special Operations Command liaisons with Pentagon-level clearance. JSOC call signs meant Black Ops. Meant officially deniable. Meant Master Chief Petty Officer level or higher. Bear walked to Laura without asking permission, pulled her aside into the supply closet, and spoke in a voice like gravel in a diesel engine, "What's your actual rank?" The question hung there, 17 years of secrecy collapsing into 2 seconds of silence. Laura's jaw was stone. Her eyes didn't blink. She said nothing. Bear nodded. He'd served long enough to recognize the architecture of classified. "You need a lawyer. You need a lawyer right now." He pulled his personal cell phone and made a call that would change the trajectory of institutional power at St. Michael's before lunch. 90 minutes later, the hospital administrator got the call that a 2-star Army general was inbound with 3 flanking officers in dress uniform, not a visit, not a courtesy inspection, but a tactical arrival of the kind that made career administrators understand they'd just stepped into something federal. The general walked through the main entrance at 9:51 a.m. with the bearing of someone who'd commanded 12,000 soldiers, and the entire administrative staff moved like iron filings toward a magnet. They assembled in the hospital boardroom. Dr. Caldwell wasn't invited, and that absence screamed louder than any sirens. The general opened a classified folder on the mahogany conference table, and his voice descended like a gavel, "Master Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett." He paused, letting the rank sink in. Bronze Star. Each word got its own beat. Silence hung. Silver Star. Longer silence. Second Silver Star. The board members exchanged looks like they'd just watched the foundation shift. Third Silver Star. The general's eye stayed fixed on the room. 2 purple hearts. Navy Cross. He closed the folder. 7 combat deployments, 2009 through 2016, Iraq and Afghanistan theater. Specialist in trauma medicine and direct action casualty management. Classified status, highest authority pending declassification. The individual in question was ordered to assume civilian identity in 2017 following operational compromise. That directive remains in effect. Any attempt to investigate, terminate, or interfere with her employment constitutes obstruction of federal personnel security protocols. Are we clear? The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then the wheelchair-bound ranger was wheeled into the boardroom by an orderly, and his eyes found the tattoo on his own forearm, Bell. Bennett, and the memory finally pieced itself together like a photograph developing in chemical solution. His voice cracked. Baghdad. Jolan District. August 2011. He looked at Laura, and 15 years evaporated. Our convoy got hit at the checkpoint. Insurgent RPG. Our Humvee was burning. 2 of us trapped in the back seat. His hands gripped the wheelchair wheels like he was pushing through rubble. She was providing overwatch from the rooftop position. 40 meters east. We called in the casualty report, and she came. Just came. 65 kilos of woman in body armor, moving through open fire like the bullets couldn't see her. His voice steadied into the cadence of someone recounting a sacred thing. She carried me first. 6 miles. Under fire. Then went back for Martinez and Jackson. Extracted all 3 of us before the exfil bird came in. She pressed a coin into my hand, tarnished thing, said for luck, and told me to go live. He looked at the general. I lived. And now I know why. The next voice came from the hallway, an FBI agent, showing credentials and a warrant, looking for Dr. Caldwell. The room's attention pivoted like a turret. The agent's tone was precision flat. We've completed our investigation into the falsification of federal personnel records. Dr. Caldwell accessed the personnel database 17 times in 72 hours, adding and altering documents with fraudulent timestamps. He contacted Ms. Bennett's previous employer with false defamatory statements. He attempted to obstruct a federal background investigation. The handcuffs came out. They made a specific sound, a click, like a door closing on one life and opening another. The hospital board chairman distanced himself with the speed of a man who'd suddenly understood which side of history he was standing on. Caldwell tried to maintain composure when they found him in his office, tried to act like a man who'd simply made a professional error, but the muscles in his jaw betrayed him. The veins at his temples bulged like cords. When the agent said the words, "You're under arrest for falsifying federal documents and obstruction of justice," Caldwell reached for his professional identity like a man reaching for a life preserver that had already sunk. This is a misunderstanding. I was protecting hospital standards, but the agent was moving him toward the door, and the hallways had filled with people. Every person he'd ever bullied was suddenly visible. The dietary worker he'd called sweetheart. The tech he'd blamed for his mistakes. The residents he'd humiliated during rounds. They lined the corridors in silence, and they watched. The photographs would surface later, images of Caldwell in handcuffs, his suit rumpled, his face redder than his medical school diploma, being escorted past the nursing station where he'd once stood victorious. But Laura wasn't in those hallways. She was in the ranger's room, checking his vitals as a fully reinstated member of the medical staff, reading the monitor with the competence of someone who'd done this in field hospitals under fire. The ranger asked why she'd never told him. Her answer was quiet, the voice of someone who'd been ordered to disappear and had become very, very good at it. I was ordered to stay gone. You earned your peace. You didn't need to carry me too. The hospital moved swiftly after that. The administration offered Laura a new position before the day ended, director of the new veteran care wing. It wasn't an apology, because apologies are insufficient for what had been done. It was an acknowledgement that the invisible had finally surfaced, and the institution was intelligent enough to recognize value when it became visible. 2 years later, Laura walked through the veteran care wing every morning, a space she'd built from nothing, with dedicated staff and specialized protocols, a place where former soldiers weren't turned away or questioned. The wheelchair-bound ranger worked there too, peer counselor for incoming vets, his smile steady and his presence a constant reminder that healing was possible. In the entrance, framed under indirect lighting, sat the tarnished military challenge coin, the one Laura had pressed into his palm in Baghdad, finally returned home. It sat beside his photo like a relic, a physical proof that invisible bonds held weight, that memory was currency, that some contracts transcend time. One afternoon, Laura drove past a strip mall on the outskirts of Houston, and through the plate glass window she saw him, Dr. Caldwell, sitting alone at a folding table with a handwritten banner, "Discount insurance policies." His tie was crooked. His hair had gone gray in the years since the arrest. Passers-by moved past him like water around a stone. He looked at each one with a desperation that had crystallized into resignation, the expression of a man who'd spent 2 years understanding that institutional power is borrowed, that hierarchy is circumstantial, that consequences arrive when you dismantle the wrong person. She didn't slow the car. There was no satisfaction in it, just the simple fact of his new normal, playing out in real time against the skyline of a city that had moved on without him. That evening, back at St. Michael's, a young veteran arrived in crisis, screaming, violent, 3 staff members struggling to contain him in the admission bay. Laura approached slowly, her voice level and calm. I'm Laura. I'm a veteran too. You're safe here. Something in her eyes transmitted what words couldn't. She understood the particular shape of his terror because she'd held the same shape in her own hands, buried it in classified files, carried it across 15 years of civilian life. The man's breathing slowed. The fighting stopped. 2 hours later, he was stabilized, and Laura sat in her office filling out the paperwork. The ranger wheeled in quietly, placed coffee on her desk. Another save, he said. She shrugged. Outside, the Houston night had settled over St. Michael's, and inside the veteran care wing, the light stayed on, a place where no one gets turned away, where competence isn't a threat, where the invisible finally surface. The ranger gestured to the framed challenge coin on her desk, her own, the one she'd kept all these years. You know what I tell the new guys? The ones who think they're too broken to help anyone. Laura looked up from her paperwork. He smiled. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. If this story resonated with you, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss stories like this. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? Let's hear your stories.